Okay, this talk is about the war on drugs and police brutality. Breonna Taylor is sadly the perfect example of an innocent victim of the war on drugs. Police in Louisville were investigating two men that they believed were selling drugs from a house that was far from Breonna Taylor's apartment. However, the police had a warrant to search her apartment because she used to date one of the men that they were investigating, and he had previously received packages at her apartment. On March 13th, the police banged on the front door of Breonna Taylor's apartment, and Breonna and her boyfriend got out of bed. Both she and her boyfriend asked who was at the door but did not receive response before police used a battering ram to break the door off its hinges and enter the apartment. The police officers were not dressed in uniforms, and Breonna and her boyfriend thought they were being attacked by criminals. Breonna's boyfriend fired a gun once and hit one of the police officers in the leg. The police responded with significant gunfire and shot Breonna 5 times. Breonna did not receive medical attention for at least 20 minutes and died from gunshot wounds. While originally the police had a no-knock warrant, it had been changed to knock and announce, meaning that the police had to identify themselves. Breonna's boyfriend said that the police officers never identified themselves. The officers claimed that they did. Breonna obviously was not alive long enough to corroborate her boyfriend's assertion that the police never identified themselves. There were no drugs found in Breonna's apartment, and Breonna's ex-boyfriend, the one who they had been investigating, has also publicly stated that she had no involvement in the drug trade. To this date, the officers involved still have not been charged in her death. Richard Nixon said that drug abuse was public enemy number one and declared the war on drugs in 1971. This declaration enabled him to increase federal funding for drug control agencies and to propose stricter measures for the enforcement of drug laws. This resulted in the creation of the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, and the Controlled Substances Act. The Controlled Substances Act classifies drugs that are considered controlled substances into 5 schedules according to their purported medical use and potential for abuse. Schedule 1 drugs are classified as having a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use, and include things like marijuana, heroin, LSD, and psilocybin. Schedule 2 is high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, and includes things like Oxycontin, morphine, fentanyl, and cocaine. Schedule 3 has some potential for abuse and an accepted medical use. This includes things like Vicodin, ketamine, and Tylenol with codeine. Schedule 4 is low potential for abuse and accepted medical use. This includes things like Valium, Xanax, Ativan, and Tramadol. And finally, Schedule 5 have an accepted medical use and they're considered the lowest potential for abuse. This includes things like cough syrup with opiates in them. While the classification of most drugs, Schedules 2 through 5, is generally backed up by scientific research, it's easy to argue that the classification of many Schedule 1 drugs is not. The most notable of these drugs is marijuana, which has as much lower potential for abuse than many of the Schedule 2 drugs. Research has also documented some medical benefits, particularly for pain management, appetite stimulation for wasting disease, and reduction in some childhood seizure disorders. LSD and psilocybin also have potential medical uses, primarily related to reduction in depression and anxiety symptoms. However, the scientific evidence on these medical benefits is scant and certainly not strong enough to be conclusive, because the ability of scientists to research the effects of these drugs is highly limited due to the fact that they're classified as Schedule 1 drugs. 2 drugs that are notably absent from this drug scheduling system are tobacco and alcohol. These are both legal but mildly regulated drugs. Tobacco has no accepted medical use, a high potential for abuse, and responsible for about 480,000 deaths per year in the United States. It's about 1 out of every 5 deaths. It's the leading preventable cause of death. Alcohol, which is also legal, is estimated to cause around 88,000 deaths per year in the United States. Last year, it was estimated that there were 70,980 drug overdose deaths in the U.S., 50,042 of which were from opioids, the majority of which are classified as Schedule 2 drugs. There are no known overdose deaths attributable to marijuana, LSD, or psilocybin. Thus, the legal status of these Schedule 1 drugs is not attributable to a risk of acute toxicity. In 1994, Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, discussed the creation of Nixon's war on drugs policy in an interview for Harper magazine. He's quoted as saying, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people." You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Thus, the war on drugs was at least partially declared to criminalize and disrupt black communities. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan doubled down on the war of drugs and expanded the use of mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. He signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which required a minimum sentence of 5 years for a drug offense that involved certain amounts of illegal drugs. Notably, the 5-year mandatory minimum was applied to 500 grams of cocaine, but only 5 grams of crack. This basically made sentencing for the possession of crack 100 times more severe than sentencing for cocaine. In the 1980s, crack was associated with poor black communities and cocaine was associated with wealthy white people. Thus, this discrepancy in sentencing has a strong racial bias, and the enforcement of mandatory minimum sentencing has contributed to the high rates of incarceration in the United States, particularly for drug-related offenses. In the state of Indiana, as of August 1st, there were 6,137 people in prison for drug-related offenses, which represents about a quarter of Indiana's total prison population. As a side note, this includes 63 people who are in jail for possession of syringes or needles, meaning that they did not even have illegal drugs on them. The proportion of people in federal prisons for drug-related offenses is much higher. As of August 29th, there were 68,025 people in federal prisons for drug offenses, which represents 46.2% of the federal prison population. When counting all people in prison in the United States, there are approximately 500,000 people currently in prison for drug-related offenses. Although only about 13% of Americans are black, 38% of the prison population is black. As a reminder, last year there were 70,980 deaths in the United States due to drug overdoses. Thus, by absolute numbers, incarceration is a much larger threat to illegal drug users than drug overdose is. Since the 1980s, funding for police forces to support the war on drugs has increased significantly. This has resulted in an increase in the police force. The number of police officers increased by 27% between 1992 and 2008. And the number of drug-related stops of citizens that has been made were also largely increased. Over the past 50 years, the threshold that needs to be met for police officers to be able to legally stop someone on the street to search them for drugs has significantly declined. A Supreme Court case in 1968 ruled that officers only needed reasonable suspicion that someone had engaged in criminal activity instead of probable cause to stop and search someone. In 1996, a Supreme Court ruling allowed officers to make pretext stops, meaning that they could stop someone for one violation even if they suspected a different violation. For example, an officer could stop someone for a broken taillight with the actual intention of their stop being to search the car for drugs. In 2000, the Supreme Court ruled that simply running from a police car was suspicious enough behavior to allow officers to stop and search anyone running from them. When the threshold for a search was lowered to reasonable suspicion in 1968, officers were not supposed to use any force or handcuff people when they were stopped. However, a number of rulings over time have changed this, and stops and searches are now allowed to involve handcuffs, police weapons, and long detentions, which blurs the line between a search and an arrest. While the threshold for police officers to legally stop and search someone has been getting low over time, police officers have also been becoming more militarized. Starting in 1981, the military was able to give police officers military equipment and training in order to support the war on drugs effort. Thus, the line between the armed forces who are supposed to destroy the enemy and police officers who are supposed to protect civilians has been blurred. Special Weapons and Tactics, or SWAT teams, were originally created in the 1960s to deal with hostage situations and terrorist attacks. Now 90% of the time that SWAT teams are employed, it's to serve search warrants, and those are usually for drugs. SWAT teams are heavily armed with military-grade weapons. Some even have grenade launchers and tanks. There's been a drastic increase in the number of cities who have SWAT teams, and now 89% of cities with populations greater than 50,000 have a SWAT team. There are more than 100 SWAT raids each day in the United States. These SWAT raids involve substantial property damage as well as psychological damage to the people whose homes are raided. SWAT raids can be deadly, as a number of unarmed people have been killed when SWAT teams invaded their homes. SWAT raids are significantly more common in communities with a higher percentage of Black residents. Thus, Black residents are at a higher risk of experiencing militarized policing tactics. One study by the ACLU reported that drugs were only found 35% of the time that SWAT teams conducted drug raids. So not only are SWAT teams dangerous because they cause property damage and inflict psychological and physical harm, they usually are unsuccessful as well. Only 2/3 of the time that SWAT teams invade a home looking for drugs, 2/3 of the time that they invade a home looking for drugs, they don't even find any. Another study found no evidence that SWAT teams lower violent crime or reduce the risk of violence toward police officers. These changing policies have contributed to the legitimization of police brutality against people of color in the United States under the guise of the war on drugs. Stop and frisk became increasingly common in the certain areas of the United States as the war on drugs intensified. New York City is well known for its stop and frisk policing, which disproportionately impacted people of color. In 2011, at the height of stop and frisk in New York, almost 90% of people who were stopped were innocent. While the number of stops have drastically decreased, in 2019, 66% of people stopped were innocent. In New York, only about 10% of people who are stopped are white, even though about 1/3 of the city is white. Police have been known to consider presence in certain locations where there has previously been drug activity enough to constitute probable cause for a stop and frisk, so anyone walking through that area can be subject to a stop. However, these locations can easily be high traffic areas that residents of the neighborhood regularly walk in order to get to their homes, schools, or workplaces. Thus, it became that living in a certain area was enough to be considered suspicious of engaging in criminal activity. And the people who were most likely to live in these neighborhoods were people of color. Residents of these communities report that the constant threat of being stopped by the police is a significant psychological stressor. People knew that they could be stopped at any time and have a gun pointed at their head while they were searched. They might also be the targets of derogatory comments such as racist and misogynistic insults by police officers. The war on drugs is also associated with increased incidences of sexual assault by police officers. Police officers have sexually assaulted civilians when conducting unnecessary and illegal pat-downs, strip searches, and cavity searches. In one case that made headlines, 2 police officers in New York arrested an 18-year-old girl for possession of marijuana and then raped her while she was handcuffed in the police van. Both of the officers admitting having sex with her, but claimed it was consensual. Since then, New York has changed its law so that it's illegal for a police officer to have sex with someone in custody. However, there are still 34 states in which police officers can legally have sex with people in custody, as long as they say it's consensual. However, the power differential between someone who's being detained and the person detaining them makes free consent impossible. While police have been busy attending to the war on drugs, they've neglected communities of color in other ways. As police departments allocate more resources to the war on drugs, data has indicated that they pay less attention to property crimes and violent crimes in vulnerable neighborhoods. In the United States, the enforcement of drug laws generally causes more harm to our society as a whole than the drugs do themselves. The war on drugs has increased police brutality while having no discernible impact on the supply and use of drugs in the United States.